This afternoon I'll be speaking in a lower octave, but I'm very glad to be with you. This is such a marvelous series that Jeff and others have put on here at San Marino, and I feel privileged to participate in it. 2 weeks ago we had Mark and Phil and Mark Eaton talk to us really about how the Reformation began to cross the Atlantic to the New England colonies. My thesis this afternoon is that whatever the tradition, however we understand the Christian faith, it's always in a process of transformation. That transformation comes from within. You might think of the Apostle Paul, who takes the message of Jesus and brings it to a wider world. His own first letters, the first and second letters to Thessalonians, are really challenged and changed as he gets to Galatians and Romans, and then the early church. We discovered in this whole series that the Reformation is a renewal movement. It's the taking of what Martin Luther had understood from medieval Catholicism, and through his fresh engagement with the Bible, discovered the gospel in a fresh way for us. But my thesis is that that Reformation will itself change dramatically. So the Puritans believe they are crossing the Atlantic and simply transplanting what they had learned in England to a new geography. They will realize very quickly that that geography will begin to challenge and to change who they are. In a modern way, there's a kind of a word out there, the church changes when it crosses the Rockies. Those of you who have grown up in New Jersey or Illinois or Georgia or Wisconsin will understand that's very different than Southern California. The culture of the place where we live begins to challenge and then to change our faith. I've supplied a handout for you this afternoon, and the two longest sections are what I would like to call lived religion. It's the idea that we have to understand, how did people of the time experience their faith? One of my friends, Don Dayton, made the observation some years ago, I'm thinking now of the death of Billy Graham, that if you would have traveled in the 1970s to the libraries of Harvard Divinity School or Yale Divinity School or Princeton Theological Seminary, you might not have found a single volume written by Billy Graham. Because the, quote, now we use this word, elites, they would have the volumes of Paul Tillich, but they wouldn't have the volumes of Billy Graham. So what I want to talk about this afternoon is the way people experience the Reformation in this brand new space and place called the United States, first the American colonies and then the United States. Let me begin with a story. The story probably took place in the late 18th century, maybe early 19th century. Princeton Theological Seminary was founded in 1812. It believed that it was teaching the theology of John Calvin, and a young man was brought before the Philadelphia Presbytery for ordination. Any of you participated in presbytery, you know that when an applicant comes forward, he or she is examined. And so the question, sometimes the questions can be quite something. The question that afternoon in Philadelphia was to this young man, would you be willing to be damned for the glory of God? That was the question. Would you be willing to be damned for the glory of God? We'll get into why that question was asked. I imagine this young man paused for a long time. He realized he was under the gun. He had to answer this question. What would he say? And finally he stepped forward nervously but boldly and said, "Sir, I would be willing that this whole presbytery be damned for the glory of God." What's going on? What's going on? I felt this afternoon that before we could get to the United States, to the American colonies, we needed to understand the way Calvin became Calvinism and Luther became Lutheranism. So if you look at your handout, I begin to make this suggestion. It's not really that surprising if you think about it. Luther and Calvin were dealing in a fresh, dynamic way, often, especially for Luther, in a kind of a fragmentary way, taking just the book of Romans or just the book of Galatians or just the book of Psalms. Calvin begins the Institutes by saying, well, we could begin with God, or we could begin with man. Either way would be a good beginning, but I think I will choose to begin with God. And although he elicits in those Institutes kind of a comprehensive guide for Christian living, I would argue that he doesn't try to answer every question. He recognizes that these questions are ambiguous. He's still struggling himself with what the answer will be. The thing that we need to understand is that our inheritance is often not Calvin, it's Calvinism. Our inheritance is not Luther, it's Lutheranism. What do I mean? I mean that the next generation or generations will take this dynamic, fragmentary impetus of Luther and Calvin and turn it, understandably in many ways, into what I would call something systematic, where every T needs to be crossed, every I needs to be jotted, and it becomes very logical and very rational. So I've supplied two examples for you here. The first is the Dutch Calvinists, who come up with what's called the Synod of Dort. They are facing a challenge. The Christian faith is continually facing challenges to its own belief, its own orthodoxy, if you will. And the challenge comes from what is called the Arminians. And the Arminians are kind of worried that perhaps this sounds rather closed, that only some are elected, that God's grace is irresistible, that what about those who maybe be outside the church? And so they pose a kind of a liberal, we might say, challenge to the Calvinism of the day. Well, the Synod of Dort gathers in the Netherlands to answer this challenge. And they come up with the 5 points of Calvinism to which there will be no deviation. And these 5 points are total depravity. Don't you dare suggest that there is anything that human beings can do of their own that is good. Unconditional election. There is no free will in this world. It is only the unconditional election that comes from God. Limited atonement. Christ did not die for the entire world. He died only for those who are the elect. Irresistible grace. If God calls you and works in your life, there is no way that one can push against that grace. And finally, the perseverance of the saints. That once elected, these saints will persevere through all of history. What I'm suggesting here is that there's a wonderful impetus here to take the teachings of John Calvin and to say, well, but we're receiving challenges to these teachings. Let's see if we can codify these teachings. Let's see if we can make sure that there's 5 points here to which we must all agree. Just to give you a modern example, I've been deeply involved for much of my early parts of my life with Young Life, this wonderful movement of which Jeff O'Grady's been involved in, and Phil Eaton, and many of us. And for 6 summers, I taught at the Young Life Institute in Colorado Springs in the 1970s and 1980s. And Young Life, to me, was this incredible, fresh movement founded by Jim Rayburn in 1941. Not really very theological in a sense. Its whole strength was what they called relational evangelism. It was the idea that you would have friendship with young people, and out of that friendship, you would draw young people who were not involved in the church into not a church setting, but you'd meet in a home, and you'd introduce them to the claims of Jesus Christ. How exciting, how wonderful. It touched me as a high schooler. I started a Young Life Club when I was at UCLA. And then one day in the 1980s, someone said, now we need a statement of faith. Now we need a statement of faith. We need to codify who we are. And the fascinating thing was that the members of the faculty said, no, you don't need a statement of faith. You don't want a statement of faith. Because what the statement of faith will do is it won't include people, it will begin to exclude people. There are the statements of faith, of the historic statements of faith. You don't need a statement of faith. The Synod of Dort is a statement of faith. We're going to take the impetus of John Calvin and we're going to say, here are these 5 points. And you either believe them or you don't believe them. And if you don't believe them, then you're not a part of the Reformed Church as the Dutch knew it in that day. The second example that I've given to you is the Westminster Confession of Faith. This grows up in England. Remember we said, you may not remember we said this, but there are really three Reformations. The Lutheran and the Calvinist Reformation are what I would call theological reformations. They grow out of a deep encounter with the Bible, a fresh encounter with the Word of God. The English Reformation is in many ways a political reformation. The king wants to figure out how he can divorce his wives, and he's not getting any help from the Pope. So he's going to separate himself from the Pope, and he will become the leader of the Church of England. And so it becomes a political reformation. Well, then King Charles is overthrown. The Puritans are momentarily in control. The Presbyterians want to find some ascendancy. And so if we're going to codify this new understanding of the faith, we need to put it in writing, the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's a beautiful confession. It's complete, it's literary. It has a wonderful sense about it. But take a look at it now. Just take for a moment and read it very, very carefully. This is what I call orthodoxy. This is a difference from John Calvin when we get to the Westminster Confession of Faith. Do you notice how complete it is? That's the meaning of orthodoxy. We don't want to leave anything out. God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. This obviously had to be written by a committee, which it was. Yet so as therefore thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is that's a big question, is God the author of sin? Nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. This is beautiful, but this is not John Calvin. This is not Martin Luther. This is a future generation. Take a look at Article 3. By the decree of God, what begins to be important in orthodoxy is the decrees of God. By the decree of God, for the manifestation of his glory. Hear that phrase, glory? Would you be willing to be damned for the glory of God? If you are elected for the glory of God, logically, you ought to be willing to be damned for the glory of God. Do you see the logic in that? Of course you do or don't. I'm not sure if you do. And others foreordained to everlasting death. How about number 5? Those of mankind that are predestined unto life, God before the foundation of the world was laid, according to his eternal and immutable purpose, and the secret counsel and good pleasure of his will, has chosen in Christ into everlasting glory, out of his mere free grace and love, without any foresight of faith, or good works, or perseverance in either of them, or any other thing in the creature as conditions, or causes moving him thereunto, and all to the praise of his glorious grace. You see how everything is included. I can imagine sitting in on that committee. I mean, this went on for months and months and months. They were debating word by word by word. What I'm arguing here is that there's something beautiful about this, but there's also something that begins to become deadly. It becomes to systematize the dynamic gospel of Jesus Christ in truth and love. And so what happens is there sets in, as there always will be, a reaction against the Synod of Dort, a reaction against the Westminster Confession. And what's the most common phrase by which they call this reaction? Dead orthodoxy. Dead orthodoxy. It's absolutely true in a way, but it's lifeless. It is so intellectual that it just sort of stifles the person's kind of freedom. You know, we're struggling with that today, if you think about it. The churches that are growing today are the churches that are experiential. And this is a challenge for those of us who are Presbyterians, because we believe in a thoughtful, and you are experiencing here in this congregation, a thoughtful presentation of the Christian faith that appeals to the mind. I was chatting with my son. We went 5 years ago to the Maui basketball tournament. We're great Gonzaga fans. And my son said, "Dad, I want to tell you something." He said, "You know, I've stepped away from the Christian faith for quite a few years, but I believe that I want to come back, and I wanted you to know this." Wow, I was pretty thrilled. He said, "But I have a real struggle." He said, all of my friends are going to these big box churches in Spokane. And it seems to me that what these churches are saying, please check your brains at the door when you enter. He said, "I can't do that. I have to turn," he's worshiping at the Episcopal Cathedral in Spokane. He said, "I can't check my brains at the door." But this is the problem that's going on. We seem to be so often intellectual that we're missing young people who want to be experiential. I spoke 6 weeks ago at the First Presbyterian Church in Dallas. Three city blocks, this historic church. They're trying to reach out to the young adults who are just flocking into the center of Dallas. But they're confronting this amazing problem. All of the young women who are part of these young adults are worshiping in churches that don't ordain women. It just boggles our mind. So what's happening here is there's a dead orthodoxy here, and there must be a response. So I'm suggesting to you that before we get to America, one of the three responses will be American, but there are two other responses. The first response to this dead orthodoxy, and that's a phrase they use, is what we call the movement of pietism. The movement of pietism, a movement of the heart, of heart religion. It also takes place in Germany, just where the Lutheran Reformation began, and then it begins to spread across the continent of Europe. Pietism. Pietism is, what is it? It's a reaction to the intellectualism of the churches of the day, that the churches are so intellectual, they have missed the experiential, they've missed the heart. It's a reaction against the kind of formalism of the day, often the very formal liturgy that doesn't seem to them very different than the Catholic liturgy from which many of them had experienced. And so they stressed what? The personal religious experience. Where would you find that experience? They began to form on Sunday afternoons small groups to study the Bible, to pray together. And here's one of the issues that often happens is they often felt they did not get the affirmation of their own ministers. So often it became a laity movement against the clergy of its day. The clergy, they felt, were still stuck in this dead orthodoxy. They were still preaching on Sunday morning, you know. Cynthia and I had the privilege about 5-6 years ago of spending 2 weeks in Oxford. And I remember we arrived on Friday and she said, "Well, I think I'd like us to," she said, "could we worship at Christ Church in downtown Oxford?" I said, "Well, we certainly can." I said, "I'm not expecting very much, but let's see what's going on there." So we went down there, and it was a perfectly fine sermon. There was nothing wrong with it. There weren't very many people there. This is the historic Church of Oxford. And then we came home to our place, and we noticed next door the place was buzzing. Well, we were living next door to an Episcopal church, an Anglican church in Oxford. So I said, "We better go there." So we went to the Anglican church that evening, and there were hundreds and hundreds of Oxford students at that church. The next Sunday morning, the minister stood up and he said, "I want you to know that in this Church of England, the center of this church is the Bible." Wow, how unusual. The center of the church is the Bible. And hundreds of people were coming. The church is hungry for renewal. There was nothing wrong with what we'd experienced in Oxford, but it was very formal, very straight-laced. It didn't have anything that could attract Oxford students, even though it was right in the center of the Oxford colleges. So pietism is a renewal or a recovery of the religion of the heart. This is what the Christian faith is all about. Now, there's always a side story to this. It also becomes what? Often quite anti-intellectual. Anti-intellectual. Check your brains at the door when you go to the big box churches. It becomes anti-intellectual. Across the channel in England, a movement of renewal took place. The Wesleyan revivals. John and Charles Wesley never left the Church of England. I had the privilege at age 27 to study for 1 year in a Church of England seminary. It was a remarkable experience. I remember about the third day I was there, a fellow met me. We were compelled to go to prayer 3 times a day at this church. and a young man told me that he had been converted in the Lord's Supper. And I said to him, would you tell me that again? I'd never met anybody who told me he'd been converted through the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. It was an exciting experience. But John and Charles Wesley believed that the same thing that was happening in Europe was happening in England. There was a formalism. There was a lack of vitality. And so they began to fashion what they called the methods. The methods, that's where we get the name Methodism. The methods were of people studying, often on Sunday afternoon, often with or without the affirmation of the clergy, to recover the teaching of the Bible. Wesley tells his own story. Thomas Carlyle, I think, describes England at that time. He says, England was stomach well alive, soul extinct. Stomach well alive, soul extinct. So Wesley went as a missionary to Georgia. And on the boat he was traveling with, his traveling companions were a group of Moravians. And these Moravians, who were people of a religion of the heart, challenged his own faith. And so Wesley came back really he wasn't even sure he was converted. And I love the story that he tells that in 1738, he went to a meeting at what's called Aldersgate, and it was May 24, and he heard a message read from Martin Luther's preface to his commentary on the Romans. This is what he heard. And Wesley wrote in his diary, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given to me that he had taken away my sins. And so John Wesley becomes this dynamic preacher who begins to preach in the mines at Bristol, preach in the fields, but he's attacked by members of his own Church of England. He's forbidden to preach in some of their pulpits. If you begin to have this heart religion, you may be opposed by those religious authorities of whatever the denomination is. And so John and Charles Wesley with his great hymns, begin to offer this Wesleyan revival, which reaches out to the poor, which begins to both challenge the Church of England and reach out to the people of England in fresh ways and Scotland. Well, now let's cross the Atlantic, because the third of these great revival movements is what we call the Great Awakening. And what I did here is to tell you, give you the story of just an ordinary farmer, Nathaniel Cole, which I think captures the excitement of this. This diary was found quite a few years after Cole's death, but I'm going to read it because I think it just captures the excitement, and it really asks, are we excited about the Christian faith? I was in my field. He heard that Whitefield was coming. George Whitefield, I should back up a moment. George Whitefield is a friend of the Wesleys. He has come to the United States, and he will embark on 7 different evangelistic tours all the way from Georgia to Maine. And he will break with traditions, we'll say more about him in a moment, by preaching again, not simply in churches. Often they did not want him to preach there, they refused their pulpit to him, but he would preach in the town square or wherever he could gain a hearing. And so I wanted you to capture a sense of what this might be when Farmer Nathan Cole hears about this. Someone rides past his farm telling him that Whitefield will preach that day. I was in my field at work. I dropped my tool and ran to my wife, telling her to make ready quickly to go and hear Mr. Whitefield preach at Middletown, then ran to my horse with all my might, fearing that I should be late. Having my horse, I with my wife soon mounted. We improved every moment to get along as if we were fleeing for our lives, all the while fearing that we would be too late to hear the sermon, for we had 12 miles to ride. After the furious ride, Coles described a scene that opened before him. I saw before me a cloud of fog arising. I first thought it came from some great river, but as I came nearer the road, I heard the noise of horses' feet coming down the road, and this cloud was a cloud of dust made by the horses' feet. When I came within about 20 rods of the road, I could see men and horses slipping along in the cloud-like shadows. And as I drew nearer, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, scarcely a horse more than a length behind the other, all of a lather and foam with sweat, their breath rolling out of their nostrils every jump. Every horse seemed to go with all his might for the saving of souls. This is an entry of a diary. This is not some historian writing 50 years later. It made me tremble to see the sight. Finally, Cole gets close enough to see Whitefield, who looked as if he was clothed with authority from the great God. Cole listened to a powerful sermon. When it was all over, he recorded his response. It gave me a great heart wound. I saw my righteousness would not save me. So my question here this afternoon is, what's happening? Luther and Calvin are operating in a very, very different cultural phenomenon. Luther actually uses the phrase that whatever the religion of the prince will be the religion of the people. So that if the prince decides for the Reformation, then you will be a part of that. If the prince does not decide for the Reformation, you will then remain within the Catholic Church. All of the churches there were established churches. Suddenly we get to the colonies, and especially after the American Revolution, to a whole new situation. We are the heirs in many ways as much not simply of the European Reformation, but of the American revival movements. It's kind of combined in our DNA as to who we are today worshiping this afternoon. Well, what is George Whitefield's message? Think about Luther's message or Calvin's message as we listen to this. First of all, Whitefield wants you to know that your faith is not part of your birthright or your ancestry. It is not simply something that you inherit. You'll hear echoes of Billy Graham, I think, as you think about this and as we've been reading about Billy Graham in the last week or 10 days. I was there at the 123,000 meeting in the Coliseum when Billy Graham spoke. You may be a Sunday school teacher, he would say. You may be an elder. Notice what he's saying. This is your birthright, but you have to make this decision for yourself. Whitefield is the precursor to Billy Graham. Each person, Whitefield argues, needs to have his or her own change of heart. Yes, we believe in baptism, we believe in covenant, we believe in family, but we also believe that each person needs to make that decision. Whitefield is really moving from what I would call the right theology to the right experience. He's not distancing himself from the theology of John Calvin. He actually is distanced himself with John and Charles Wesley because he's becoming more of a Calvinist. They are Methodists, more free will. But what really begins to matter is not theology, but experience. Now step back for a second. I would argue that this understanding of the Christian faith is particularly amenable to America because it's very democratic. If you have the right theology, that sort of assumes that you have the intellect and the education to even think about this theology. If you have the right liturgy, it also presumes that you have some sort of prior understanding. To have the right experience takes no prior understanding, no prior intellect, no prior liturgy. Experience is open to anybody. I mean, I wasn't able to be here this morning, but the story of John Perkins is a great example of that. Here this man starts with very little education, struggling in a very oppressive situation in Mississippi, and yet he's offering the gospel to people no matter who you are, of what race you are, because the experience of the Christian faith is open to anyone. This is Whitefield's message. It is, in a certain sense, anti-intellectual. He's really struggling with dead orthodoxy. It's often pretty anti-intellectual. He's sort of saying your intellect, your reason, your rationality is not going to save you. It's also very, at first especially, it's very anti-ministerial. He's really speaking out against these dead Orthodox ministers who are presiding over churches in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey. They've not helped you. So if they criticize me, that doesn't bother me a bit. I'm calling you out to be your own faithful people, regardless of whether your ministers are for or against what I'm doing. The ministers are part of the problem in this kind of renewal effort. They're part of the problem. In the emerging church then, and I'm using a modern term, in the emerging church, individual experience is the arbiter of faith. Individual experience. This is Pietism. This is the Wesleyan Revival. This is the Great Awakening. We move to an experiential faith. Now, I want to argue also that Whitefield is a very, very smart person who takes advantage of the new American situation. Skip Stout, Harry Skip Stout at Yale, has written a phenomenal book on George Whitefield that just still deserves to be read, in which he calls it the divine dramatist, the divine dramatist. And he argues that Whitefield originally wanted to be an actor. And so now he really transforms his acting into being a minister. And so he's really a performer as much as he is a minister. I mean, Whitefield will come to Philadelphia and there'll be thousands and thousands of people, and in the crowd is Benjamin Franklin. Well, Benjamin Franklin is a deist. He doesn't believe any of this stuff, but he's absolutely entranced by Whitefield. He thinks this is the greatest communicator I've ever met in my life. And he writes all these incredibly positive things about Whitefield because Whitefield knows how to perform. He'll often use the illustrations of women because women are in that audience at least 50%, so he uses female illustrations to evoke their response. Whitefield is an actor turned preacher, so Scott argues. Well, Whitefield chafed against the authority in effect, whether it be the authority of the state or the authority of the church. He was bothered, bugged, we might say, by the fact that the church fathers wouldn't give him accession to their pulpits. So when they did not, he said, all right, I'll preach in the town square. I'll preach in Nathan Cole's farm fields. That's what I will do. He aimed, therefore, at what we might call, this is his word, extra-institutional solutions to well-established problems. We don't have to remain within the institution. We can figure out some new ways to spread the gospel, whatever that might be. Whitefield understood that there was a whole new upsurge of newspapers coming to fore in America. So he began to place ads in these newspapers. He would advertise the gospel in these newspapers. Let's take advantage of what the culture offers to us. His outdoor preaching became very, very successful. He realized that in America, social stratification was not at all like it was in England. And therefore, he wanted his audiences to understand that anyone was welcome. I remember, again, Cynthia and I, on that particular trip, we went for her birthday weekend to the Isle of Wight. And there we took the historical tour, and we walked into this church, and everybody had their pew. And I don't mean just pew, I mean the pew had walls on it. And you sat in your pew, and I tell you, the wall was about 7 feet high so that nobody could tell you, And if you were Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so and you paid the most amount of money, then you had the front pew. If you paid the next amount of money, all the way down, there's a strict pecking order on this. You better know who you were. My first fieldwork assignment at Princeton Seminary was at the New York Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church with Bryant Kirkland, and I loved his wife, Bernice. She had been told when he arrived as the senior minister that this would be her pew, and no one else could sit there. And she said to the ushers, but that won't be my pew. Anybody can sit there. I will sit all over this church. But you'd arrive at Fifth Avenue and you'd walk up, oh, no, that's reserved for Mrs. So-and-so. Now, they don't arrive within 5 minutes of the beginning of the service. Then you can sit there. But if not, no, that pew is reserved. That's the pecking order. And Whitefield decided to break that order. And that's how he began to expand his, what we would call revivals. So what he understood was that his success would be dependent upon public opinion. He had to gain the public opinion of the newspaper editors or the leaders of the community. This is what would advance what he wanted to do. And that this access would grow according to his own popularity. So at the end of the day, what we're saying is that legitimacy in England and Europe came from the top. It came from the prince. It came from the king. It came from the bishop. In America, legitimacy in a certain sense comes from below. It comes from the opinion of the people. It comes from what ordinary people think and feel. You may have a title, president, CEO, pastor, professor, but at the end of the day, it's what people think about that that will determine their willingness to follow or not to follow you. Sarah Edwards, the wife of Jonathan Edwards, if we had more time, I would have liked to have said more about Jonathan Edwards, who becomes, in a sense, the intellectual defender of this movement, the idea that experience does matter. But Sarah Edwards, I thought, offered this really remarkable description of George Whitefield. He makes less of the doctrines than our American preachers generally do, and aims more at an affecting heart. It is wonderful to see what a spell he casts over an audience by proclaiming the simplest truths of the Bible. I have seen upwards of 1,000 people hang on his words with breathless silence, broken only by an occasional half-suppressed sob. A prejudiced person I know might say that this is all theatrical artifice and display, but not so will anyone think who has seen and known him. Well, to be fair to the story, you might think yourself, what is the response to this? Well, there's a furious criticism of this, because what will they accuse George Whitefield of doing? Disrupting the established order of the churches. And so many of the leaders in Boston, some who will ultimately become Unitarians, will mount an attack upon Whitefield. How dare he come in here and break our established order? This anti-intellectualism of George Whitefield. What's all this experiential stuff of the heart? But I'm arguing that the Great Awakening begins to put in place a distinctly American understanding of the Christian faith. It's not inherited. It often is not very theological. I wish it sometimes were maybe more so, but it's really based on the new birth. The idea that each person can enter into the Christian faith by his or own way, and that strong preaching will emphasize this experiential dimension and not simply repeat the sort of axioms of theology that might have been part of the past. I'm going to pause at this moment. I don't want to go too fast and just say, let's pause for a moment, have some comments and questions. We've covered quite a bit of ground from orthodoxy to the renewal movement against dead orthodoxy, and now to the particular American phenomenon of this, what we call the Great Awakening. Are we recording this? We are, so we better go use the microphone. That's right, pardon me here. Professor Eden.
You mentioned several times, Ron, reflecting on Billy Graham, as we've been doing,
yes.
all of us.
Right.
Quite a moment of remembering, of course, and the nation remembered. I mean, it was just been pretty phenomenal.
Yes.
You're making this point, I know, but this really is the roots, I think, of the Billy Graham phenomenon. Right. He was preaching out of, you just look at this list, and I mean, it really fits him very, very well. Yeah. And I say that positively because he was a tremendous influence on my family.
Yes,
and
yes.
My father was the chair of the 2 crusades that happened in Phoenix. And so we were deeply involved as a family. And I often say that Billy Graham saved our family from fundamentalism.
Yes.
And so again, just to reinforce what you're saying is just beautiful here. These are the roots. This is the really beginnings of that kind of revivalism that is when you sort of wonder where it's all going to go, what is the next phase? Is there another revival? Will this continuing evolving and reforming going to happen? I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, this might be a big topic of conversation, and perhaps even more as we get to the end of our session, but I think there's quite a bit of discontinuity between Billy Graham and his son Franklin Graham. That Billy Graham had this wonderful way of being involved with political leaders, but never becoming political. And Franklin Graham has become extremely political in his point of view, and very anti-Muslim, some really strong statements. So Billy Graham is a wonderful model that could reach the Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, who in his own way endured some criticism, because when he went to the New York crusade, my seminary roommate's father was the chairman of that crusade. He had been invited by the Protestant Council of New York. And so sitting on the platform with him in the New York crusade in 1954 were members of divergent religious traditions. So those who were fundamentalists or very, very conservative were extremely critical that Billy Graham would allow an Episcopal minister or a Catholic bishop or something to sit on the platform. But so I saw one of the op-eds in the last 10 days called Our Ecumenical Evangelist, that somehow he was able to reach across these various traditions, never compromising what he felt was the biblical gospel that he was proclaiming, but he was able to reach across and pull a lot of different people in. Some were critical of him. Reinhold Niebuhr was critical of him, but I think that was overstated. Those of us at Monte Vista Grove who heard a wonderful lecture on Reinhold Niebuhr recently. So I think Billy Graham is a great model, but I think the question you're asking is, where does it go from here? And is there anyone of that kind of stature that will carry it forward? I think that's a question to be concerned about. Other comments or questions? Yes. We're going to use the microphone.
I'm not sure how to phrase this, but to what degree, and perhaps you can just say this is a simplistic understanding, was there not in the years we've just been talking about in America particularly, among the immigrants of all social levels, a kind of given Judeo-Christian ethic that they inherited either
Yes.
overtly or covertly or unconsciously and brought with them, that then was the milieu brought with and inherited, that then ran up against and was shaped by what was happening through Whitefield. Is that milieu gone in this country today, Ron? I'm jumping ahead, I know, but the question of who's going to step in, so someone steps in, but what are they stepping into?
Thank you, Jane. That's a wonderful comment. Yes, the quick answer is there was a givenness to their understanding of the Christian faith and what this meant. I've heard ministers today, as I've been in various conferences, say, well, you can no longer presume that the people you're preaching to have any understanding of the Bible at all. So some of them say, well, therefore I can't preach biblically. I wouldn't come to that conclusion. But I mean, you can't understand, you can't presume that they have this understanding. My new biographical project is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg. And as a young man, he memorizes just all 107 question and answers of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. He just thinks that's a normal thing you would do. And he goes out at age 19 to his first teaching assignment, and I love it the way he says it. He said, fortified by the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Well, who today would go out and say, I'm fortified by the Westminster Shorter Catechism? In other words, this is a part of who they are. This is their DNA, however we wish to describe it. Now, they will confront new challenges, which we'll talk about, but they bring this with them. Yeah. Anyone else?
In the 21st century awakening that we would have in the future,
Yeah.
what place do you feel that centering prayer and meditation will take within the forming churches that are not currently using meditation and centering prayer as a connection of heart and mind.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, I think one of the surprising developments of the last 30, 40 years is that those of us who are Protestant, and some of us grew up, depending upon our age, with a kind of anti-Catholic bias, are now beginning to discover or rediscover perhaps some of the traditions of the past which might have been more a Catholic tradition, and beginning to appropriate them for ourselves in a very rich way. And so this is a new form of pietism. Sometimes I worry that the word pietism or piety has become a bad word. It's not a bad word, it's a good word. It's really it's a word of experience, but what you're suggesting is there's other forms of experience. I think we're also discovering that some of those people had that experience also. We just didn't see it. My early work was on the social gospel. I'd been taught growing up in the Glendale Presbyterian Church that this was something terrible to be feared, the social gospel. Oh my goodness sakes alive. But I was asking myself the question, what had happened in the years prior to Martin Luther King Jr.? Had the churches in any way confronted racism? So I went back earlier in time, and I got to know the theologian of the social gospel, Walter Rauschenbusch. And when I say the theologian of the social gospel, I'm already saying, oh, that's who he is, his theologian. Well, one day I was at a meeting of the American Society of Church History, and the name of the man is going to come into my mind momentarily. It's there. And this man was a famous professor of American Christianity who sat in Rauschenbusch's chair at the Rochester Theological Seminary. And he said, I have to tell you today, he said, I'm 75 years old, that I never knew the man, even though I taught him for 50 years. He said, what am I saying? I never knew the experiential side of him. I never knew that he edited a songbook with Ira Sankey, the song leader for Dwight L. Moody. I never knew that he was influenced by the Keswick movement. I never knew. He said, I only treated him as a theologian because that's the way I was trained in my PhD, and I didn't understand and couldn't enter into the experiential side of Walter Rauschenbusch. I never knew the man, and I'm guilty of presenting a man to the public that I never knew. So I think the centering prayer, what you suggest is, this is kind of giving a whole new life to Protestant congregations. Very helpful. Well, let's see, it's 5 o'clock. Let's take a break for 10 minutes, come back, and then I want to talk about what I think is the most distinctive movement that begins to shape who we are today. Heirs of the Reformation, but a little bit different form of what it means to be an heir. Let's take a 10-minute break. I believe that stories often convey deeper truths once we think a little bit about them. So let me begin with another story to start our second half of our session this afternoon. It was a fall evening in 1818. Lyman Beecher, the sort of scion of this incredible Beecher family, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Henry Ward Beecher, Edward Beecher, on and on and on, is going to bed with a very heavy heart. We don't really remember this, but when the First Amendment was passed, it disestablished any church at a national level, but the church continued to be established in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And now a big vote was going to take place. And the question would be, would the church continue to remain established, which that meant the taxes of every citizen would go to support the minister, go to support the upkeep of the congregation, or would that all end? And Beecher was terribly worried about the result of the vote, worried that the establishment of the church in Connecticut would come to an end. He was wary of the outcome. He couldn't imagine how the church could go forward without being established. This just wasn't possible in his mindset. He woke the next day to discover that the forces of disestablishment had won, barely by a couple hundred votes. But instead of depression, as he tells it later on, he experienced elation. Years later, he wrote in his autobiography, "Now we are thrown upon our own resources and upon God." Now we are thrown upon our own resources and upon God. If any of you have traveled, as you have, to churches in Great Britain and Europe, so many of those churches are established. The buildings, as Jane Holslag knows so well, in Germany are just remarkable, because every German citizen pays a tax to the church. Unless they make the effort to go to the right authority to say, I do not want my taxes to go forward, so most of them don't do that. So the facilities in Germany are remarkable. There's only one problem. Nobody's attending, or very few people are attending. So what happens now when the colonies become a nation? Well, this is another surprising story, that even with the Great Awakening, which is a powerful force, by the time of the American Revolution, church attendance, church membership has declined to something around 10 to 15% of the population. Now, we must remember what it meant to be a member of the church. I remember Cynthia and I were with a group from La Cañada, and we were at the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Nairobi, Kenya. And a young couple was presenting their infant daughter for baptism. And the minister said to the couple, this is what we need to start doing here at San Marino. I want, if as a testimony, what is the testimony of your faith? And the young couple turned and they said from memory the Apostles' Creed in front of the entire congregation. That would scare a lot of people away, wouldn't it, in America? So you had to give a narrative of your Christian experience to become a member. It might be a conversion, but it might also be something, you'd have to say this to the leaders of the church. So church attendance was, church membership, not necessarily attendance, was very low, because you had the experience of people attending church, and then when communion was being offered, they would exit. They would exit because they were not professing members of the church. Only those professing members would stay. Also, America had looked across the waters to the French Revolution, and they had seen what had happened. It had become very violent, very secular. We think that we look back with rose-colored glasses that, oh, everything just must have been terrific when the American Revolution came into being and we promulgated a constitution and we had the Bill of Rights. No, there was a great deal of uncertainty. And then we forget this story. Thomas Jefferson is elected President of the United States in 1800, and this just sends the Christian population into terror. I mean, this is the man who had torn out of his Bible all the stories of miracles and the stories of Jesus' resurrection and published his own Bible. So Jefferson is viewed as this secular deist enemy of Christianity, the way the story was told in those days by many practicing Christians. And then what's going on in New England, the foundation, the story that Phil and Mark told of the Puritans in New England, now church after church after church at the beginning of the 19th century is renouncing its congregational Orthodox beliefs and moving to become Unitarian. And so if you travel to New England today, you will notice these churches that all look exactly the same, but one church will be congregational and the next will be Unitarian. So what's going on? How are we to respond? How are those who are the heirs of the Reformation to respond? We began our series here rightly focusing on Martin Luther. This is the 500th anniversary of the nailing of the theses at the door at Wittenberg. But at the time of the American Revolution, as small as the church membership was, 85% of the memberships were heirs of the Calvinist Reformation. They were congregational. They were Presbyterian. Those were by far the two largest churches at the time of the American Revolution. They were French Huguenot. They were German Reformed. They were Dutch Reformed. They were Waldensian. All of these were varieties of the Calvinist Reformation. This was who they were. But now the question arises, how are they going to move forward? How are they going to renew the church if they're down to 10 or 15% of the population? So they come up with what I describe as a kind of a new principle for a new nation. How will they go forward? And the principle that we're describing is what we call volunteerism. We may not use that word all the time, but it's absolutely central to who we are as an American nation, be it the American Red Cross or be it the San Marino Community Church. It's all based on volunteerism. Where did this concept come from? What is it all about? Well, I've given you another sense of what I call lived religion by inviting you to join a delegation from the Congregational Union of England and Wales who came to New York in 1834 for what was called Anniversary Week. Get ready for a busy, busy schedule. On the first day, on Monday, May 5, you would want to attend the American Anti-Slavery Society. You would also be open to attending the American Seamen's Friends Society at 7:30 p.m. The next day, you could attend the American Anti-Slavery Society. The children of the Sabbath schools would appear in the park at 3 p.m. The Revival Tract Society would be meeting at 4. The American Tract Society would also be meeting at 4. The New York Sunday School Union, 7:30, would be a meeting. And you could attend other meetings such as the Presbyterian Education Society, the Seventh Commandment Society, the New York Temperance Society, and just so you'd get your day started right, there were daily prayer meetings at 5:30 a.m. to launch the day. So what's going on? Well, after the American Revolution and Article 1 of the Bill of Rights, which disestablished the national church, the question really was, how could Christianity grow and flourish in a new nation? One answer was denominations. The point of the First Amendment, which is often very misunderstood by those who want to secularize our understanding of our beginnings, is not that the nation wanted to distance itself from religion. It actually wanted to say, no, we will not allow one particular church to dominate. We have each come from the Catholic Church in various nations, the Church of Scotland, whatever the church might be. We want to create what I would call a parity, where every denomination is on an equal playing field. Thomas Jefferson had understood in Virginia that the Church of England was the established church in the Church of England, but as he looked around him, he saw that there were far more Presbyterians and Baptists in Virginia than there were Anglicans. So it wasn't that he was for or against any of these. His bill for religious freedom simply says we cannot establish any one church. The church, we need to be open to multiple churches, parity of churches. This is what we have created for our own particular culture. But a second model is, and so the denominations grow, and although I said that the Congregationalists and Presbyterians were the two largest in 1776, by 1850 the two largest would be Methodist and Baptist, and Presbyterians and Congregationalists would be less than. And one thing that those of us who have been involved in Presbyterian theological education often say is that while we were educating our clergy, you have to be a college graduate and you need to be a seminary graduate, the Methodists were winning the West. Their circuit riders were mounting their horses without that kind of formal education, and they were mounting the West. So Ulysses S. Grant's family helped found the Methodist Church in Georgetown, where he grows up. There is no Presbyterian church. It's the Methodist Church, and it's the Baptist Church that moves west and south to plant its flag. But the second model is what I call volunteerism, or I would call it the evangelical voluntary societies. By the middle of the 19th century, there are over 300 evangelical voluntary societies shaping the life of Christian people. The flagship society is the American Bible Society. It's founded in 1816. It's the only one of those societies that still exists today. And how does those societies get founded? Well, often they're founded by a challenge or a problem or an issue. For example, in the College of New Jersey, which will one day be called Princeton University, a student observes another student tearing the pages out of a Bible, as Thomas Jefferson did. He is outraged by this. So he helps found a kind of chapter to promote the Bible there at Princeton University. Well, these all come together in 1816 to form this remarkable American Bible Society. It is incredible. If you ever get a chance to visit their headquarters in New York City, it is something very worth doing. Just quite something to see who they are and what they have become. They become the ones who begin to publish the Bible widely, no more so than in the Civil War, when all soldiers, both Union and Confederate, would carry either the Bible or portions of the Bible on their person. Well, let's talk a little bit more now about the voluntary societies. Get my notes here together somewhere. Here we are. What are the characteristics of these societies? First of all, these societies, let's give the definition: a voluntary association of individuals organized to do a specific task. Task is the key word. Not organized around a theological creed, not organized around a biblical confession, but we Americans are doers. And so evangelical voluntary societies are organized to do a specific task. So as you think about it and look back on it, these societies are based with individuals, not churches. It's interesting, if any of you have served on the boards of a seminary or Young Life or whatever, you're not serving on that board because you represent the Lutheran Church or you represent the Presbyterian Church or the Baptist Church. You have been asked to serve because you as an individual. Individuals are those that form these societies, not churches, individuals. And therefore you've been asked, most of you, because you are laity, not clergy. On the boards of these organizations, whether it be Whitworth or Fuller Seminary or Princeton Seminary or whatever, more and more the dominance of these boards is made up of lay people, ordinary lay people. This would not be the way it would be in Europe, where even as the Catholic Reformation becomes the Protestant Reformation, it is still very much a clerically dominated organization. Finally then, and thirdly rather, these organizations are really based around deeds, not creeds. Deeds, not creeds. What we will do together. Finally, and not understood completely at the time, these organizations offer the opportunity for a role for women. Women would not be ordained in the church until the middle and latter part of the 20th century. But when you're asking about doing something, women step forward, right, to do something. So women take on a role in these voluntary societies that they are not yet permitted to take in the very denominations of which they are members. They step up to participate. And finally, these societies are cooperative. It's interesting, Phil, you've been president, you've served on the board at Whitworth. Jeff is the chairman of the board of trustees of Princeton Seminary. They're often what we would call interlocking boards of directors. You find someone who's on the board at Fuller, and they're also on the board of Young Life. You find someone who's on the board of Princeton, and they're also on the board of this. And so although these are distinct organizations, there is an informal kind of interlocking directorate where these people have a shared sense of values. So I've listed for you here what I think are some of the key societies. The American Bible Society, the American Education Society. And by education, it's meant that still we're asking ourselves the question, what is the basis of our education? What are we forming children and young people to be and to do? And remember, this is the evangelical voluntary society, so what is the role of the Christian faith as we educate people? The American Board of Foreign Missions, founded in 1810. I should have put the dates on here. These are all in the early decades of the 19th century. The American Board of Foreign Missions, which will first begin to send out missionaries to the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, and then all across the world. The American Sunday School Union, The whole idea that we should have Sunday school, and Sunday school is not understood just as simply children, but also adults. The American Tract Society, the profusion of the publication of tracts that we might promote the gospel and the Christian faith. The American Colonization Society, 1817. This society grows up as people recognize the dilemma of how are we going to have a society that is both black and white. And the American Colonization Society, which is often very misunderstood, is formed not simply by whites but also by blacks to begin to go back to Africa and go to the nation of Liberia and begin to Christianize Africa by starting in Liberia. It also works as a safety valve, some believe, as we can't seem to solve the racial question in our own society. And then finally, and very forcefully, the American Anti-Slavery Society formed in 1833. So these societies are where people pour their energies in, and they have incredible recruiting mechanisms for people to participate. And the anniversary week that I had you read through in New York, well then, they will then go to Boston and have another week to do these sorts of things. So volunteerism, I'm suggesting here, becomes the principle by which the Christian faith goes forward. Just as an aside, I think the question we're all facing today is, will the next generation become volunteers? I spoke at a meeting in Palm Springs on Thursday, hardship duty, and this is called the Committee of 25. It was formed in 1948. And they talked about the difficulty of getting new people to join their committee. One of our Rotary, is it Rotary or Kiwanis clubs in La Cañada has just ended after 50 years. Do people step up to give to the church as they once did? Or do they only give to specific things? What about the role of women who are now working and their role, all the women's societies that once were the base bedrock of congregations? Volunteerism, you know, the United Fund, do we still have a United Fund? I don't know we do. Volunteerism has been a principle by which this nation has gone forward. But the studies that I read say that volunteerism is in trouble today as we seek people to step forward to do things beyond themselves. Well, these societies didn't come into existence just to simply reform the Christian faith as heirs of the Reformation. As I suggested at the outset, Reformation takes place both by within, we rethink the faith, but it also is meeting a challenge from without. What is the challenge that these people seek to meet? The first challenge that they seek to meet is what's called the city. What is a city? America is moving slowly, for sure, from an agricultural economy, an agricultural nation, to a city nation. Lyman Beecher, the great evangelist that we've spoken about, is actually delegated to go to Boston because Boston is now becoming this city of Unitarians. Boston, the fountain of Puritanism, is beginning to abandon so-called, what people say, the Christian faith. So Brimstone Beecher, as he's called, is sent to Boston to see whether he can stem the tide, whether he can do something there. And we know in the 20th and 21st century that traditional Christian denominations have a very, very hard time in the city. Well, already this becomes a problem. A second problem is what they call the West, or they would call it the Valley. In other words, Lyman Beecher is so smart that he says the heart of this nation by the 20th century will not become the Atlantic seaboard, but it will become what he calls the West. He's not yet thinking of California, but he's thinking of the Middle West or of the Valley. And whoever controls that valley and the education of the young people growing up in that valley will control the nation. So listen to what he prepares this, what he calls a plea for the West. Now Beecher, who seems to be everywhere, is out in Cincinnati. He's the president of Lane Seminary and the minister of the First Presbyterian Church. His daughter Harriet is beginning to watch what happens as these slaves cross the Ohio River and through the Underground Railroad try to gain freedom in the North or in Canada. And this will become the fodder for her later novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Beecher travels west every winter to raise money for the exercise of these voluntary societies in the West. And he says, if we do fail in our great experiment of self-government, our destruction will be as signal as the birthright abandoned, the mercies abused, and the provocation offered to a beneficent heaven. And Beecher believes there's a great enemy out there in the West. Who is the enemy? What is the enemy? It is the surge of Catholic immigration that begins in the 1830s. And these Catholics do not stay necessarily on the East Coast, they head towards the Valley. They head towards the Midwest. And Beecher, hard to say this today as we have very different perceptions of our Roman Catholic friends, he sees the Roman Catholic Church as anti-democratic, which they are in the 19th century, as very much against labor unions as they are in the 19th century, as holding on to power. And so the reason that we need to be in the West is to counter this enemy, the Antichrist, who is the Pope. Well, these voluntary societies are quite remarkable. They really form the pattern of who we are, both as a congregation and as we do in our regular society as the way we raise money and promote. Let's just pause there for a moment and see if we got some questions or comments about this. I think this is a remarkably interesting story. Anybody? Yes, Jeff. Oh, got to get the microphone. I surprised you with that.
Thank you. I'm really interested in this idea that has been throughout our history of volunteerism and belonging. And so much of what I'm reading today reflects on the changing nature of belonging in our country. The example you used, which was probably a Kiwanis club that has disbanded, Robert Putnam wrote about in Bowling Alone, that all these kind of associations that have existed are deteriorating, and it's affecting the church as well. Mm-hmm. Can you reflect a little bit on this lessening of belonging in the culture and where you think that might be headed?
Well, that's quite a good comment and question. I think we have two forces that are always been at work in our culture and society. The one which we trumpet is our individualism, that we in America are free to be whoever we want to be, to promote our individualism, to become that individual. But the second story is the story of community, and this is where you get to the story of belonging. That the Christian faith, is it the story of an individual or is it the story of a people? Is the Bible the story of an individual or is it the story of a people? And so belonging, I like that phrase, is really the outworking of this sense of community. So people joined these voluntary societies as a sense of belonging, and they were members of multiple societies. This gave them something that allowed them to be together. Are we losing that face-to-face dimension as we have our own phones and other things that make us quite distinctive? How can we meet this in the church? It seems to me that in many ways the church offers something that the rest of the society is not offering. That what we're doing here this afternoon, what we do on a Sunday morning, gives us a kind of way of being together that is really not very possible. But the question also becomes, is it generational? I mean, I think my generation and older, we just said, well, this is what's happening on Sunday morning and we'll be there. I think the next generation say, who is preaching? What is the band? What is the event? And I will decide whether I go or not. And this gets to the realm of giving. I think in the past we just gave to the church. Now people might give or wish they could give to the children's program or to the choir or whatever. Someone, Lewis Weeks, has suggested that two-church hypothesis some years ago, that we used to join a church and we thought we were joining the Presbyterian denomination at the same time, or the Methodist denomination, or the Episcopal Church. Now people do not feel or even want to join that larger body. There's a distancing itself from institutions. We may join a particular congregation, but we don't think of ourselves as joining this larger body. And is this part of the kind of anti-institutionalism that I think we are experiencing? We talk about anti-government, but I think it's much larger than that. There's kind of a distancing ourselves, or even a hesitancy to involve ourselves in denomination. Would you like to say more? I'm not the, you've thought a lot about this. Let's have you say some more, Jeff.
I don't know what I can add to what you've just said. I think it was a really helpful description. I do think that there's generational changes that are taking place, and the ways in which younger people are connecting with one another has changed drastically with the technology. And it, in some ways, it seems to me that we've created pseudo communities that don't really require anything of you and offer some identity that you can take and use as you will, but it doesn't require anything. So it's quite different than the church, which calls us to be part of a community and make sacrifices for that community as well. So that's quite different. It seems to me that there has been a shift, a generational shift. You know, my parents, when they married, they entered the institution of marriage, and then they saw themselves as serving the institution, rather than marriage serving them. Now, today, I think people enter into a marriage and see that institution as in service to them. And they only need to participate as long as it continues to serve their individual needs. And then if it does any longer, I'm done with this and I move on to something else. So there's an inversion that seems to have occurred, which I think all of our institutions are trying to understand and deal with.
Yeah. Well, what your comments say to me is that this whole understanding of volunteerism presupposes this sense of community, but no longer can we presuppose that. We are free to pick and choose, and that's very difficult for voluntary societies then to coexist in that way. I love this quotation that I put on for you. Orestes Bronson is actually a Roman Catholic who becomes converted, and I don't like to use that term. He changes his affiliation to becoming a Protestant, but he says, "Matters have come to such a pass that a peaceable man can hardly venture to eat or drink or go to bed or get up to correct his children or kiss his wife without obtaining the permission and the direction of some moral society." So you could argue two ways here, you see. You could say, hey, these moral societies are telling us what to do, you know, and this is what I think some young people feel about the church. They're overarching, they're too much. The other side, oh no, they're giving us guidelines, they're offering us opportunity, they're informing us, they're educating us to do these wonderful things for society. So there's two different ways, even at that time, that people viewed the Great Awakening, the way they viewed the voluntary societies. My point this afternoon is to say that the Reformation of, and we'll conclude with this and have some more comments and questions, of Luther and Calvin presupposes, first of all, Christendom. That even though they were challenging the Roman Catholic Church, they were not challenging Christendom. They believed that the Western world was a world of Christendom, and that everyone participated within this world. And that's why Luther would be willing to say that if this is the religion of the prince, then it should be the religion of the people. When you get across the Atlantic, you enter into what's called disestablishment. That these established churches that they had known in Europe are no longer established, no longer preferential, no longer supported by the taxes of the people. And you have, for the first time, a parity of denominations. So you could say to yourself or to your neighbor, you know, how many Presbyterian churches did you drive by to worship here this morning? Or how many Protestant churches did you drive by to worship? A week ago, we had a wonderful Welsh Presbyterian Saturday afternoon service at Monte Vista Grove. And I said, well, what happened to the church? It was there for 134 years in Los Angeles, 134 years. Well, then that Welsh community, which had all congregated in that particular part of Los Angeles, they all dispersed, and in 2012, there's no longer a church. That's volunteerism. The church doesn't exist by some bishop saying, we're going to have the Welsh Presbyterian Church. It does or does not. And so I just am asking us to think about volunteerism as an American form of how we communicate the Christian faith. We do so with preaching, but we also do so with deeds. And this is an ecumenical way by which we can participate with each other in ways that perhaps were not really practiced in our European forebears. There's so much more we could say. We could talk about what happens when the church does cross the Rockies and when it takes root in California or Oregon or Washington. I think it's a very different form than when it takes place in the East or the Midwest or the South. Why? Because I go back to my original thesis. The Christian faith encounters culture, and that culture ultimately changes the particular shape and form of the way we practice the Christian faith. And we have to be aware of the times when we want to challenge that culture and say, no, the culture is not going to change. And when we also try to say, well, let's try to understand this new culture, this different generation culture, and understand how, therefore, we can communicate the gospel in that setting. Let's pause for some questions and comments before we close. Here we are, thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned the volunteerism based on deeds and not creeds.
Yes.
And to carry that out to what I would call the outer limits right now, Twitter and GoFundMe accounts where they're very, very specific, and it's a way of rounding up the troops for just this one event, and then they disappear.
Ah.
And maybe that's where it's going to be in the future, but it's not necessarily a Christian thing. But
right.
as Christians who participate in that, that's a way to evangelize. Whether they say, well, why are you doing this? They say, well, I'm a Christian, and this is what we do.
That's a good example.
Throwing it out there. I don't know.
Good example. Let me come back with the deeds, not creeds. When I was teaching a course in the history department at UCLA on religion and American history, we would take one day and we would visit the Catholic Cathedral, first AME, and then a Jewish place of worship. And the young woman who was the rabbi at this place of worship told us this story. She said, now we believe in deeds, not creeds. That's her language. She said, I grew up and I went to an Episcopal girls' school in Connecticut, and I appreciated that, but I'm a Jew. And she said, Judaism all based on deeds, not creeds. But she said, here's the problem. We're part of an association of Jewish synagogues, and one man applied for worship. And when he came before us, he said, I do not believe in God, and nor do the members of our congregation, but I wish to be part of this association. So she said, what do you think we did? She said, we ultimately decided no. It's deeds, not creeds, but you have to believe in something. So she said, we finally decided we would not allow this particular person into our association, because you could push the deeds, not creeds so far that there's no creed behind it. I mean, this is the dilemma of offering a preschool or offering a soup kitchen. At what point do you do that simply as offering something good for the community? At what point do you do that in the name of Jesus? How do you do it in that way? A lot of churches have struggled with that question. Yes, here we are.
I'd like to go back to something that you said early in the presentation. We've been talking about the generational differences that exist today. And most of us are parents and have children and grandchildren. And when you said your son had an experience where he felt like he had to check his brain when he goes into the experiential church. I'd like to know whether you have gained any insights or lessons from his journey, because most of us are seeing that same thing happen with our children in their communities.
Wow, that's a powerful, powerful question, and we all struggle with our children and grandchildren, don't we? Well, I think one thing that seems to be learning is that we do have to have experience as a part of the worship experience, that it cannot simply be cerebral. How we do that in a way that works well. I think we could all have quite a conversation if we talked this afternoon about what we think of praise bands and praise music, and that's a generational question, isn't it? But young people seem to be looking for this experience. So my story of the First Presbyterian Church of Dallas, thinking that they should be offering a ministry to all of these 20-somethings, and they're just kind of dumbfounded that these young women are going to churches which are not ordaining women. Why would they do that? Well, their answer is they have found something else there which seems to meet their needs, their experiential needs, and they're willing to kind of set that aside. Even though the leadership of those churches is all male-dominated, they're still going to that churches. I can't figure out. And so he said, but the problem is on us. We have to provide something for those young adults, those young women and men in their 20s. And can we do that? And this becomes a challenge for the so-called establishment churches.
Yeah, but this is tremendously fascinating to me, this whole subject. We are all... what's that? Put it closer to my mouth. Okay. I think everybody needs community. I mean, you sort of come back to some real basic assumptions. But we are all individualists. We're individualists as Americans. We're individualists as Protestants. We are individualists even as New Testament Christians. Mm-hmm. But there's always the other balancing side of that. You think of Paul establishing all of those new churches in the early church. Tremendously important, coming together, serving one another. Did they fight? They fought, and the arguments, the Corinthian church, of course, there was all kinds of tension among them. But they came together, and Paul's preaching always was, to love one another, come together and serve one another, and then brought together through the gospel of Christ. So the point, I guess, I don't know. I mean, I've thought about this an awful lot. I think this none of us in this room will give up our individualism. We will stand for ourselves, and yet we desperately need community. And the disintegration of community, the challenge of community in our time, I think, is one of the largest crises of our moment. The whole thing of bowling alone and all of this stuff that's being talked through about the loneliness that comes out of individualism extending itself, separating itself from any connection. This, it seems to me, is where the church has an answer for our society, is to provide community, a place to belong. And we belong around our faith in Christ individually, but we belong together. So,
thank you, Phil. That's very, very eloquent. Let me conclude with something that Phil and Mark told us in their presentation. I'm suggesting that the gospel, the understanding of the shape of it, changes when we cross the Atlantic. But I'm always brought back to the words of John Winthrop, who is the layperson who preaches his sermon in 1630 on the good ship Arabella, before the people will disembark in New England. And he says these words: "Whatever we shall be together. Whatever we shall do together. If we suffer, we will suffer together. If we rejoice, we will rejoice together, because together we are the people of God." So I think that this is our challenge. how to, whatever the shape may be, denomination, congregation, voluntary society, to discover for our time how we can be individuals, but how we can enhance the sense of community. And I quite agree that the church has a huge role to play, even as we discover together how we can play that role more effectively. Thank you very much.